Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. That poem is like the anglerfish's lantern, that it hangs out thousands of feet under the water in the cold darkness, and fish are attracted to the light, and they come to it, but right behind it in the dark is the giant, long black fangs.
All right. My name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined, as always, by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. That, of course, was a friend of the show, Alex Jones, with some literary criticism, I guess you'd call it, of John Lennon's song Imagine.
Before he got into the criticism part of it, I was thinking, remember how Shatner did that spoken word album like 10, 15 years back? I liked his rating.
The Shatner Common People is so classic. That's
I would like to hear a spoken word rock album by Alex Jones. He's got a great voice. I liked his criticism too, but
sure.
we didn't hear enough of it to give a proper refutation of it. So we'll have to devote probably a drunken post game to actually analyzing the philosophy of what he was saying. But Andy, you brought this to our attention. Have you been keeping close tabs on the man?
Not really that much over the break, but I noticed when we came back, I was just checking things out, just running down some stuff, and I saw that he's had a couple of philosophy videos. So I'm like, let me watch them. And this was the second one I watched. The first one being social Darwinism. So, he's hitting the important stuff. John Lennon's lyrics, social Darwinism.
These are in the series of J. Andy's children saying, "Dad, I'm hungry," and J. Andy saying, "No, I'm doing something important. I'm working right now." Hours and hours of Rumble videos.
Yes, exactly. Well, what I want to talk about now, in the break between this and our discussion I'm going to have with Spencer Case, who is a philosophy professor and the host of a podcast I've been on a couple times called Micro-Digressions. He's certainly, has politics well to my right, but, he's a thoughtful guy. And, I'm looking forward to that conversation. But the episode would be incomplete if we didn't say, look, okay, so yeah, sure, Spencer's a philosophy guy, but he's a podcaster, so how can you take anything a podcaster says too seriously, right? They're silly people. And then Alex Jones, of course, is Alex Jones. So what I really want to focus in on here are the contributions of a really important thinker, unlike any of the rest of those, which would, of course, be the scion of one of the most prominent political families in the United States, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And he has gone on a long, strange journey over the last couple of years. I've been documenting in a few different places. Back in 2023, he was running for the Democratic presidential nomination, which meant that he was in the business of, trying to appeal to pissed off Democrats, to run against Joe Biden. And in lots of ways, lots of people who are left or at least vaguely left adjacent, kind of saw that as a challenge to Biden from the right direction. And then he dropped out to run as an independent candidate. He kind of tried to secure the support of various third parties. Back then, for example, he would say things like Donald Trump, who he was running against, was a warmonger, who had, torn up the detente with Iran, who'd actually helped cause the war in Ukraine by escalating tensions with Russia, by shipping heavier weaponry to Ukraine and tearing up like a missile treaty, that the U.S. and Russia had. And now he has fused his own concerns with MAGA, with this new acronym. I don't know, MAHA. I guess I'm not totally clear on how you're supposed to pronounce that. MAHA.
Yeah, I think, isn't it like it tastes really good blackened in a sandwich, right? Like maha maha. Is that what you're referring to?
Like fish, right?
Yeah.
In this case, it's Make America Healthy Again, and Donald Trump has appointed him as his HHS Secretary, Health and Human Services, and awesome. And I do have a perspective on this I want to share because, I've been following this guy for a long time. I wrote an article about him for Jacobin. So I think this was the first one back in 2023, called Populist. RFK Jr. doesn't even support Medicare for all. That's when he was running for the Democratic nomination. I also wrote something for the Daily Beast back when I was doing that. That is, it's called "Here's Why Legitimate Scientists Should Debate RFK Jr." And it was about this point where there was this possibility of Peter Hotez, who's a real scientist, going on Joe Rogan to argue with RFK about vaccines, and I actually thought he should do it, right? Because I think that it's sort of important to go into those spaces and make that argument.
That would have been platforming him, Ben, the current man in charge of the nation's health. But that would have been platforming him. So you don't want to do that because it's not like he has a platform now. If you took him from the platform of like, assuming he's confirmed, I don't think that's happened yet, but like assuming it's confirmed that being a member of the cabinet, up to the really exalted platform of arguing with him on a podcast, like you can't do that.
Yeah. I mean, he's from such an obscure family too. Who knows who these people are? The Kennedys? I mean, it's just a band that are dead, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yes, and he even already had the platform of Rogan. That's exactly right, Secret Asian Dan. And then I've been writing about him more recently since Trump tapped him for HHS secretary. I wrote something for MSNBC. Called RFK Jr. won't do a thing to help vulnerable Americans get health care. And then I actually just finished something else for Jacobin that, in fact, what I'm about to say is partially adapted, from what I wrote for them. That should be going up, I'm assuming, in the next day or so. But yeah, I've spent more time than anybody, I would say, that anybody should spend thinking about this guy, except he's actually going to be the highest ranking health official in the United States now. So unfortunately, we probably all should spend some time thinking about the man and his opinions. But to set up the opening argument that I want to do about RFK, I want to watch a old clip of him, right? So, and when I say old, I don't mean like from the 1980s. I mean from 2023, which feels like, in the relative to the overall RFK saga, this feels like the beginning of time.
And is that just a matter of different personnel, or do you need to have a public option for pharmaceutical companies? Do you need to nationalize the pharmaceutical industry? What does that actually look like?
I don't think that's the right thing. I think we need to get pharmaceutical money out of the regulatory agencies. NIH personnel should not be able to collect royalties on pharmaceutical products that they worked on, which they can do today. NIH has devolved from being a research agency that's supposed to be improving American health And instead, it's become an incubator for pharmaceutical products. So they develop, initial pharmaceutical products in their lab. And then they farm that product out to a university, and they give the universities hundreds of millions of dollars and to go through phase 1 and phase 2 trials. And then they bring in a pharmaceutical company if the drug works, which they almost always do because they can make them look like they work. And then they bring in a pharmaceutical company to do the phase 3, which is very, very expensive, may cost $1 billion. And along the way, everybody gets a piece of the patent. So NIH gets a piece of the patent. For example, NIH owns half the Moderna patent. And, there's been billions and billions of dollars, maybe 100 billion so far on that platform, on that mRNA platform that NIH developed. And NIH stands to collect half of that money. Not only that, but individuals within NIH, the deputies of Anthony Fauci, have margin rights on that patent. So they can collect $150,000 a year for life, and then their children and so on, as long as that product's being sold. And what that means is that the regulatory function of the agency is subsumed by these, the mercantile ambitions of these regulators who are no longer regulators.
Isn't the profit motive, though, at the core of that problem? Because the problem you're describing isn't unique to FDA, NIH, et cetera. You can go down, I know you would talk about the EPA, you probably have direct experience there as an environmental lawyer, but you can go down the list of these agencies and you see the way the revolving door works, you see the way that there's a lot of industry capture, because ultimately, we have a health insurance industry and a hospital industry and a pharmaceutical industry that has the bottom line as the bottom line. Isn't that really the root of the problem here?
Well, do you mean human nature?
I mean, the profit motive. I mean, putting the profit motive above health.
The profit motive is human nature.
Yeah. So, let's just go into the thing.
Yeah, I mean, well, I was just thinking of everything that's human nature is naturally something that we can't curb. We can't try to do anything about in a policy perspective, right? But Ben, it's time for the opening argument, correct?
Yeah, let's do it. So it seems to me that RFK Jr. has two kinds of apologists, depending on who they're trying to sell him to and why, although the two lines of apologetics often do overlap. The first way to defend RFK, especially when you're defending him to nervous moderate Republicans who are afraid he might just be way too much of a kook, is to say he's a reasonable guy. He's a victim of a frame-up by the radical left. Actually, he's not even really anti-vax at all. He just has maybe, libertarian concerns that the COVID lockdowns 5 years ago were too heavy-handed, or maybe reasonable safety worries about the COVID vaccines being approved in a process that was too quick or exempted the producers from too much liability. But hey, how can he be some anti-vax nutcase when he himself has taken various other kinds of vaccines and his children have, and as my favorite Slovenian would say, and so on and so on and so on. The second way to defend him, which isn't necessarily inconsistent with the first one, but might be in some tension with it, depending on how hard you lean into it, is the way that idiots like Jimmy Dore defend him, which is to portray him as a bold anti-establishment truth teller who saw through the big lies being pushed by big pharma and who's the most steadfast, the most radical, the most courageous enemy of the pharmaceutical industry. And I think both of these defenses just collapse given the least little bit of scrutiny. Start with the first one, since it's further from my core interests, so I have less to say about it, but I do want to say a couple of things. First, there's just way too long a record of Kennedy saying absolutely batshit things about COVID and about vaccines that have nothing to do with COVID to really make this defense stick. He was repeating the long since debunked conspiracy theory that vaccines caused autism as recently as 2023. The same year, he was caught on tape at a private event, with donors, speculating that COVID might be an, and I quote, ethnically targeted bioweapon. And his defenders will tell you, oh, Ben, you're not being fair. He didn't say definitely. He just said might, or I've even seen people saying, oh, he was just speculating about what might happen in the future. But in context, part of what he's saying is definitely about reasons to think that COVID itself might be one. And man, I've said the word COVID way too many times already in this segment. We are totally getting demonetized, but hell with it. He actually said that the reason to think that COVID might be an ethnically targeted bioweapon is that it has more effect on some groups than others. And he claimed it had a lot of effect on Caucasians and Black people, but exempts, and I swear to God, this is an exact quote from the recording. These were the words he used. It spares Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. So the idea that he's actually this very moderate guy with a very narrow, reasonable set of concerns is just totally detached from reality. But conversely, the idea that he's this super courageous, radical truth teller, the greatest living enemy of capital B, capital P, big pharma, is also completely ludicrous. And I realize that at this point, it might sound like the two halves of what I'm saying might be in tension too, if not outright inconsistent. Because here I am denying that he's this very moderate, mild-mannered guy, and also denying that he's this courageous radical. But I think we need to make a basic distinction here. On the one hand, the question is how extreme he is in his anti-establishment views with regard to actual medical science. And on the other hand, how extreme is he in any anti-establishment views he might have when it comes to the core fundamental injustice of the American healthcare system. The reason why ordinary Americans are so outraged and disgusted at that system that a pretty astonishing number of normies, in my experience, people who do not have generally radical views or not even particularly political, have expressed sympathy with Luigi Mangione actually assassinating a health insurance executive on the streets of Manhattan. Because my position on this is that on the first question, the medical science question, the man is out to lunch. He's out of his goddamn mind. But on the second question, the question of healthcare justice, there's nothing really radical about him at all. And that, unfortunately, is entirely consistent. I've already shown you some of my work on the first half, the conspiratorial nonsense half, but I want to hone in for the rest of this on the second half. Think about that clip we showed you a couple minutes ago. My friend Crystal asked Kennedy whether he agreed that the root of the problem with America's healthcare system was a health insurance industry and a hospital industry and a pharmaceutical industry where the bottom line is the bottom line. And he responded, oh, that just sounds like human nature. Right? That's what Jake was just saying. Crystal clarified that she was talking about the profit motive, and RFK just shrugged off the distinction. He said, these are the exact words you just saw him say. The profit motive is human nature. But there's nothing natural about the way that the United States ties healthcare to the profit motive, right? Lets it be a factor in that system. As far as I know, America is the only country in the developed world where cash-strapped diabetics sometimes die because they have to resort to rationing out their insulin. In many other nations around the world, healthcare is treated as a basic right, funded by taxation and provided free at the point of service. As far as I know, right? Not only is nobody in Canada or Britain or Norway or Sweden or etc. rationing out their insulin, nobody in those places has to stay in a job they hate because of fear of losing their employer health insurance. No one in those countries ends up staying in a bad marriage in part for fear of losing spousal health insurance. No one in any of those places who's grieving for a dead parent has to spend half their life on the telephone arguing about unpaid hospital bills. But all of these things are routine parts of American life. And of course, we know what an actually meaningful solution to all of that looks like, right? In his runs for president in 2016 and 2020, right, Bernie proposed this single-payer Medicare for all system that would be similar. I mean, the details vary, but broadly similar to what exists in the countries that I just listed. Debates over that proposal dominated the 2020 race on the Democratic side, with a variety of shades of opinion. And Joe Biden, who unfortunately ultimately won, hence Trump being president again now, thought he could split the difference, right? Said, okay, I don't agree with this Medicare for all thing. That goes too far. But how about a public option, right? That a government-run plan that maybe you could like very cheaply buy into or be heavily subsidized or whatnot would compete with the private plans. Now, he dropped that idea cold as soon as he took office. Like, I don't think I've literally heard the man mention it in 4 years. But that was his proposal at the time. And at the time, people like me, right, who were writing, Bernie is right about X, Bernie is right about Y articles for Jacobin every 5 minutes, thought that a public option, was a way worse idea than Medicare for all, right? A public plan you could buy into, however cheaply, would replicate at least some of the big problems with private healthcare, right? People who missed a couple of payments, would end up getting cut off, right? No matter how cheap you made it, and they'd be out of luck in a medical emergency. And maybe even more seriously, very much like Medicaid in the current system, it's overwhelmingly likely that there would be lots of doctors and hospitals that wouldn't take the public plan. And this gets into the more general problem, which is the sort of basic health justice objection to a public option, which is that, look, would it be better than what we have now? Of course. But it would still be two-tiered healthcare for rich people and poor people. And I think this really shows you how bad RFK Jr. always was, that he could never even really stir himself up to champion a public option, right? So a couple minutes after the part that we just showed you in the breaking points, he, like Crystal very directly asks him about this, and he says, well, my highest ambition would be to have, he uses different words, but he's describing a public option, right? He said there'd be like government healthcare, but also there'd be private health insurance. But I don't think it's politically realistic, right? So the most he would do is take the Biden 2020 position, but also say, I'm not really going to talk about that much because it's just not politically realistic. And in the part you did watch, right, when Crystal asked him if he would be in favor of nationalizing pharmaceutical companies, or even if those companies did stay in place, at least doing a public option there, right, manufacturing generic drugs in the public sector, right, he dismisses it without a second thought, right? You heard him. He says, no, I don't think that's the right thing, and changes the subject. And that interview, the part we just showed you, that was when he was challenging Biden for the Democratic nomination. And he had every incentive in the world to present himself as being more progressive than he is. And that's how bad he was even then, right? Like, now he's going to be serving in a Republican cabinet. It seems like a pretty safe bet that he's going to be even less inclined to interfere with the profit motive that we just saw him say is nothing more than human nature. And I think the basic point here is very simple, right? Our healthcare system is a nightmare, but we need to be able to distinguish between diametrically opposed critiques of it. Is the problem that rent-seeking private companies stand between, suffering people in the healthcare they need, whether we're talking about the pharma companies or the health insurers, or is the problem that the healthcare itself doesn't work, or at least that parts of it don't work, like the COVID vaccine? And by the way, the more RFK pushes quack remedies or discourages people from taking vaccines, or succeeds in undermining the scientific establishment on those questions, this is a point that actual friend of the show, not like friend of the show Alex Jones, Dr. Eric Osgood made on Twitter the other day. To the extent that RFK succeeds in discouraging people from taking low-cost, one-time preventative measures like vaccines, the more that they'll develop health problems that are going to lead them realistically to buy expensive long-term drugs from those same pharma companies that Jimmy Dore claims that RFK is the last hero standing up against. And of course, it's not like pharma companies can't make money on quack cures as much as scientifically valid ones. Oh, and I certainly haven't heard RFK endorse Bernie's longtime proposal to abolish pharmaceutical patents, just have like one-time cash prizes for breakthroughs, which makes it grimly funny to see some of these people I'm talking about running around claiming that Bernie is a shill for big pharma because he's been fighting with RFK at the confirmation hearings. And by the way, the video from Breaking Points where RFK was still trying to appeal to disenchanted progressive voters, and so, again, presenting his views in a better light than he will now, wasn't bad enough for you. I think any last lingering shred that you have in the back of your head of, oh, maybe this guy isn't so bad, should blow into the wind when you see this last clip on what happened when Bernie asked RFK a very simple question at the confirmation hearing. So to be clear about the context for this clip that we're about to watch, I mean, Bernie repeats it like 2 seconds into the clip anyway, but the question that he's answering at the beginning of the clip is, do you think healthcare is a human right?
Senator, I can't give you a yes or no answer to that question.
Healthcare a human right? Is healthcare a human right?
In the way that free speech is a human right,
yeah.
I would say it's different, because with free speech doesn't cost anybody anything, but in healthcare, if you smoke cigarettes for 20 years and you get cancer, you are now taking from the pool. Well, and so are you guaranteed the same right, or is there also a duty?
I'm sorry. I'd love to talk for an hour with you. We got a few minutes left here. All right. Every other country on earth says healthcare, whether you're poor or rich, young or old, is a human right. I'm not hearing you say that. All right. You've talked about the drug companies, and maybe we...
So, again, they're about to go on to other things, but I really want to laser focus on what you just heard. Right? There are two ways of interpreting the argument against Medicare for all, against recognizing healthcare as a human right that you just listened to. The first, and the one that kind of starts out sounding like he's doing, is a general libertarian point that the libertarian perspective on this is that there just are no positive rights, right? Or at least that's what a lot of people who we'd think of as like deontic libertarians. They're not just people who think libertarianism leads to better political outcomes. But people who are like in principle libertarians will often say, well, there are no positive rights. There could never be a right to have some people do something for you. There can only be negative rights, right? Rights for people to not do certain things to you. And certainly that's the way that a lot of his fans seemed to interpret what RFK was saying there. I posted about this, and I just said something like, "My God, what an evil answer!" And there were a bunch of his defenders swarming in the replies, and I'd see people saying things like, some of them were repeating this kind of point that Rand Paul made a long time ago. And like, I remember we did a TMBS segment once about Dan Crenshaw saying it, which is, if you have a right to have something done for you, that means that somebody else, has an obligation to do it for you. So if you think about it, if you're saying you have a right to healthcare, that means that you think that like doctors and nurses and people who work at hospitals should be slaves, right? Like that's the kind of thing that you get in the comments. Now, it should probably go without saying that none of the many countries around the world that Bernie was referring to in that clip that legally enshrine healthcare as a basic right actually enslave doctors, nurses, or hospital janitors. Just in case anybody does need to hear that said explicitly, that I promise you that's not a thing that happens. And just to reinforce that point, right? Even many conservatives and even more moderate libertarians might believe that the public has a right to, police and fire protection, maybe even that every child has a right to a public education, at least K-12, that's where they cut off. But no one thinks that anybody should be forced at gunpoint to become a firefighter or a cop or a public school teacher, right? What the left advocates is that, as with these other services, the state should provide everybody with it, free at the point of service, funded by progressive taxation, not that any particular person should be forced to go into it. The slightly less absurd version of the in-principle libertarian argument that a right to, public health care or for that matter, public schooling or, fire department or whatever is a violation of real negative rights holds that the rights violation comes not in some fantastical scenario about frog marching doctors to work with rifles poking in their backs, but in the taxation to pay for it, right? Even the scaled back version, though, doesn't really make sense when it's subjected to any kind of scrutiny. First, because even if we accept the premise that there's some sort of universal negative right against taxation, that would just mean we have a conflict between two rights, that we would now have to decide whether the right to health care for example, cancer patients was more or less morally urgent than the right of rich people to every penny in their bank account. And then secondly, the idea that if there's this universal right against redistribution, I think is either based on extremely implausible libertarian theories of property rights that, you go back to the sort of John Locke view about mixing your labor, with nature. And it's the sort of weird metaphysical view that I think is very implausible and nobody actually believes for any reason other than that it gets them the result that they want. I realize this is me being tendentious as hell, but I'm happy to have that argument anytime with anybody who's watching this who thinks I'm being unfair right now. But honestly, it always reminds me of like the theory of property rights of like little boys who are arguing about some possession. One of them's like, oh, I spit on it, it's mine now. Or else you're just doing the completely circular thing, which is like, oh, the non-aggression principle says you can't take away somebody's property from them. And well, what do you mean by their property? Either you mean what's legally theirs, in which case state redistribution can't violate that, or you mean what's morally theirs, in which case that's just begging the question. That's the issue on the table that we're arguing about, right? Is who's more morally entitled to the money in Jeff Bezos' bank account, the doctor who's treating the cancer patients, or Bezos himself? And then the other sort of way, besides that general libertarian argument, to interpret what RFK is saying here is, well, premise one, smokers who get lung cancer don't have a right to be treated. Premise two, if healthcare was a human right, they would have a right to be treated. And conclusion, healthcare is not a human right. But like, why should anybody believe actually either of the premises there, right? So maybe Kennedy is saying that treating lung cancer patients would be a waste of scarce resources. If so, it's hard to overstate how extremely extreme and radical that claim would be. As far as I know, there's no health system on the planet, public or private, that has decided as a matter of policy either that no lung cancer patients will be treated, right? Zero hospital beds for lung cancer patients, or else that they that you won't be treated if you got lung cancer in one of the very most common ways to get lung cancer, right? Which is from tobacco. So if RFK truly believes that the United States should be the first country in the world to say lung cancer patients who got it from tobacco aren't going to be medically treated, I mean, I think this is really an exciting new frontier in social cruelty that he's advocating that we cross. Far more likely, though, he's just advocating that we stay at something closer to the current level of social cruelty, right? That the idea is that lung cancer patients with money to burn, right, will still get top-notch care, and the ones who are strapped for cash will have far fewer options. And this is the last point I want to make about this. It's true enough, right? He's not wrong about this much. As pissed off as I was when I watched this clip, right? I want to be fair about this. He's right that no medical system, public or private, has unlimited resources. While taking care of lung cancer patients is an incredibly basic function of every normal medical system, very much included the ones where care is universal and free at the point of service. It's true enough that even the most lavishly funded system always has to find some way to prioritize some patients over others when you do run up against the limits of the system's resources, right? And there is always going to be a limit somewhere. That's not wrong. Right? Medical ethics boards and the like face a thankless and often grisly task in making those determinations. I don't want to undersell that issue. But the very worst, most inhuman way of deciding who to prioritize is by using financial status, right? Letting rich people bribe their way to the front of the line while other people in similar circumstances die because of the state of their bank account. And it seems to me that that is exactly what RFK is advocating, and that's obscene. All right. Any thoughts?
No, nothing. Just, pebbles in my head, rattling around. No thoughts other than that. I agree 100% with the opening arguments. I'll let you know if I ever disagree.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Then we could do the opening counter argument. Well, speaking of arguments and counter arguments, we're about to have Spencer Case on for the dialogue portion of the show. We just did the monologue, and I know that in his effort to help me prepare for this, Andy was generous enough to find a clip, I assume somewhere from Rumble, in which somebody makes a lot of the arguments I might be tempted to make, and they're slapped down. So let's take a look at that.
Yeah, I like abortions. We do need more abortion rights, though.
Why are abortions so important to you?
Because I don't want my daughter growing up in a world where she doesn't have 24/7 full-term rights to abortion. She needs abortion rights. I want her to have the rights that I only wish I had.
So you're saying you wish you could have aborted your daughter?
Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, abortion rights are the most important right we have. That's probably why the Founding Fathers forgot to put them in the Constitution. Would have been different if we had the Founding Mothers. They would have all had abortions.
Then the Founding Mothers wouldn't be mothers.
Suppose not. But abortions aren't just rights, they're an empowerment. Choosing to end the life of a non-existent life form, there's a lot of power in that. It's like playing God.
You think killing little humans should be celebrated?
Abortions don't kill humans. They kill embryos, fetuses, and babies. They're not fully formed life forms, therefore they're not alive, so they're not humans. Technically, you're not even killing anything because there's no life to end. It's not killing, it's abortion.
You don't think babies are humans?
No, not even close. Let me prove it to you. So, if you look at what science classifies as the stages of human development, it goes from embryo, fetus, baby, toddler, child, adolescent, adult, elderly. So, no, embryos, fetuses, and babies aren't humans.
But they're listed as stages of human development.
Okay, so this was good prep. I'm glad Andy found that. So not only I'm going to hold back from, I mean, I did have to throw out all my notes because like every argument I was going to make that person made, and I also decided to that the blue wig I was going to wear, I put that back in the closet because it's, I realized as I was watching that it wasn't a good look.
Fair enough. So I believe the stage is set then. And we need to get rid of this. We're in the dialogue part of the show, but we can welcome Spencer to the show. Sorry for subjecting you to probably one of the dumber videos I've seen, or maybe not. But welcome to the show, Spencer. And I'll be out to let you guys have at it. But I will be back next week, because no post game tonight, right, Ben?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. See you guys soon.
See it. All right. Spencer Case is a philosophy professor. He is the host of the Micro-Digressions podcast that I've been on a few times. I know he's written numerous things for 1,000-Word Philosophy. And I don't know, he's very productive. What am I forgetting, Spencer? Oh yeah, of course. Is Morality Real? A debate by Matt Lutz and Spencer Case with a forward by just to show what a small world all this is. Somebody whose couch I've stayed at before. Neil Sinababu. So welcome to the show, Spencer.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
So yeah, I was listening to a little bit of a episode of your podcast, Micro-Digressions, that you did on abortion. So I feel like I might have a little bit of idea. Like I'm still not totally clear, but you suggested this might be something that'd be interesting for the two of us to talk about. And I thought maybe since my own position on this is pretty boringly standard, right? Like I think that whereas my suspicion is that a lot of the sort of bioethics kind of literature on this, right? You probably spend more time keeping up on than I do, right? But I mean, I have pretty standard kind of normie leftist views on abortion rights, but I think it might be more interesting maybe to start with you giving us a general sense of where you're coming from.
Yeah, all right. So I thought this might be useful to begin with a little bit of framing here, because one of the things I've noticed is that if I hear an argument from somebody who I know agrees with me about a bunch of stuff, it automatically sounds like a better argument to me.
Sure.
Like I can't, it's irresistible. And it's got to mean one of two things. Either there is something to ad hominem argumentation, or it matters who's presenting an argument, or we're just really, really systematically irrational, or maybe both. Both could be true. So I mention this because I often get the sense, especially online, people are not attacking the arguments. They're attacking the kind of person they imagine to be giving them. So any kind of as you sort of saw from the other side with that video, of course it's some idiot with blue hair, just who believes all of the other woke stuff, but they could have picked an antagonist who shares some of their beliefs, but no, it's those other people who believe those stupid things. It's all, so the image that the online left thinks they're arguing against is the troglodyte wearing the MAGA hat, tobacco juice dribbling down the chin, swilling whatever has replaced Bud Light as the beverage of choice now that that's too woke. So, but I want to emphasize that I think the fact that abortion is a right cultural issue is really kind of contingent.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't see anything inherent about it that makes abortion a right-wing issue and animal rights a left-wing issue. And by the way, I'm very sympathetic to animal rights and animal welfare. I'm a vegan, have been for about 10 years. And so maybe I'm not the most expected antagonist here. So I do think when pro-lifers argue, they often make the mistake of trying to argue for the most robust kind of pro-life position, which in my mind could possibly be correct. The position that every abortion is a serious moral wrong from the point of conception, my view, that could be right. But the arguments that purport to prove it, I think, rely on premises that are dubious. So I just don't think that those arguments get the job done. I'll give you a couple of examples. So one popular kind of argument relies on the premise that a fetus or a conceptus even is a human life. I think that's just empirically true. But then there is the normative premise, the moral premise that says every human life has the full slate of human rights, inherently, essentially. And I just think there are other counterexamples to that, right? If I'm in an irreversible coma, it's no longer clear that I have all of my human rights and moral status and dignity and stuff. So that's kind of not a good way to argue. There's a similar kind of argument by Alexander Press where he says, I was once a fetus. I had more moral status is inherent to me. And so if I have moral standing now, I must have had it then. I don't think that argument is compelling for the same reason, which is maybe moral standing is something that I acquired along the way. So those are things that those are pro-life arguments I have doubts about. I think a more productive way to go about this is to start with like minimal pro-lifism. Are some abortions seriously wrong? And I think that is a lot easier to establish. And then once we have on the table some abortions are morally wrong, then I think we can start debating about, okay, where to draw boundaries, where to draw lines, what would a principle of moral caution push us to accept. And so that's kind of the way I think of it. So I'm open to fairly radical pro-life views, but I haven't seen an argument that has convinced me that you have to go that far. But I am persuaded that at least some abortions, and I think many abortions, are seriously morally wrong.
Gotcha. Yeah. So one thing that does immediately jump out at me about that, right, is that the whole framing of it is about, the moral status of the fetus, which is obviously one important issue right here. I mean, like it'd be silly to say that it was irrelevant. Obviously, it's very relevant, but it's certainly not the only one. And it's not necessarily the point that's always seemed most compelling to me on the other end, right? So, if you kind of think about the basic, like, normie pro-life argument, right, goes something like this, that, first premise, that it's morally wrong, and if we're being a little bit careful about this, we could add in terms like generally, right, because there are exceptions that the pro-lifer isn't going to think are relevant here, but it's morally wrong to kill persons or human beings, or some term like that, right, that there's some sort of category that you've got of bearers of moral status. Premise 2, fetuses fit within whatever category that is, right? So conclusion, it's wrong to kill them. And it seems to me there are two basic ways of resisting that, both of which, to be clear, I think I would sign on to, right? But the second one might be the one that I personally would put more emphasis on. So the first way of resisting that argument is just to push back against the idea that fetuses are part of the whatever the category is that we think has a right to life. And I think I am not very open to the sort of radical pro-life position that you said. It's not particularly obvious to me why a fertilized egg has more moral status than an unfertilized egg, even, right? In both cases you're talking about something that's literally mindless, and if you think about the kinds of things that make us usually think that something is the right kind of entity to have moral rights, I mean, even in the certainly when it comes to people, but even when it comes to like some of the animal ethics stuff that you mentioned earlier, there being something that it's like to be it, right, seems to be pretty crucial to that. So I think that I'm very I do think that, like, the further you go along in pregnancy, the more blurry, right? That's going to get, after a certain point. But certainly when it comes to like relatively early abortions, that my understanding has always been is the bulk, right, of abortions, where it's implausible, from what I know about the scientific literature on this, to think that that you're talking about something that has the capacity for consciousness, never mind anything else, like the kind of brain that can support consciousness. I am very uncompelled by the idea that is yet something that has moral rights. But then the second way of resisting that argument that I just said, the one that I think it actually feels a bit more powerful to me, is the argument from bodily autonomy, right? That this is that we generally think, right? I think that people's right to control their own bodies is a really serious, profound, important right. Like I think here about like the analytical Marxist philosopher G.A. Cohen has this example where he's like trying to convince his fellow socialists to take self-ownership intuition seriously enough to like sort of go with him into the nitty-gritty of the argument about it. And he says, look, if we imagine a future science fiction dystopia where we got really, really good at curing blindness by transplanting the eyeballs of people with 2 working eyeballs, transplanting one of them into the eye socket of somebody with 0, and then we instituted, a la the Vietnam War draft lottery, we instituted like an involuntary eyeball lottery where, if you were the unlucky winner, you had to have one of your eyeballs transplanted against their will. You could make all of these kinds of egalitarian fairness arguments for it. But like, I think nearly everybody across the ideological spectrum be like, no, you can't do that, right? That would be a really, really seriously unjust thing to do, right? Or I'm sure you're familiar with the basic outlines of this, but I mean, just to kind of rehearse, the sorts of things that people think about when they think about this, dying of kidney failure is a really like spectacularly horrible way to die, right? And people die that way all the time, right? And in the U.S., there aren't enough, donors. It's a big problem, and people talk about all sorts of ways that you could get more, kidney donors. Should you, have either a public or private way of like paying people to donate kidneys, whatever. But something that I never really hear just about anybody advocating is that we should legally force people to part with one of their kidneys, right? Since that seems like it would be a really serious violation of the right to bodily autonomy. And even with stuff like the COVID vaccine, there were a lot of arguments about what the acceptable limits were of among people who were who'd been tricked by big pharma into believing the vaccines worked, right? There were all these like arguments about the limits of like what you can do to like pressure people to take the vaccine. But again, I almost never, right? I mean, I know there are people, of course, any position you could find somebody somewhere who holds it, right? But like an extremely rare position would have been, we should just have like the CDC go around from home to home, doing like SWAT raids and holding people down, to give them their shot, because we think that would be a violation of bodily autonomy, right? And it's always seemed to me that that forcing somebody who doesn't want to be pregnant to remain pregnant would actually be one of the more severe violations of bodily autonomy. I mean, certainly way worse than making somebody take a shot. And so I'd just be curious about your sort of where you generally land on how far this set of concern takes us when we're thinking about, the right to abortion or whether you just think that this stuff is so obviously trumped by the fetus's right to life that it's sort of not on the map, or where you come down on this.
Right. Thank you. Just to sort of crystallize what you said, because it's pretty clear, but I think if there's one thing people could get clear about in arguing about this publicly, it's really when the debate is the morality of abortion, there are really 2 issues here. One of them is, what is the moral status of the fetus? And the second is, how should the rights of persons be weighed against the rights of bodily autonomy? And I think once we just have in mind that there are 2 distinct issues here, it can be clarifying. So I think the whole notion of viability playing such a central role, I suspect that comes in like the argument, I suspect that comes from confusing these 2 things, right? Like the ability to survive independently of the mother does not seem to, as far as I can tell, I don't see any plausible argument for why that should confer inherent moral status, but it is relevant for the autonomy kind of consideration. And so I think these 2 things get kind of mashed together. So do you want to focus on the autonomy stuff, and then we can talk about the moral status stuff later? Because I think it's best to pick one at a time.
Yeah, I'm happy either way. I just kind of wanted to sort of lay out the basic map of the disagreement, and then whichever one. Yeah, sure, we can do it that way. Let's do it that way.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll begin with the autonomy stuff. This typically gets traced back to this article by Judith Jarvis Thomson, as I'm sure you know. Mm-hmm. She had this famous thought experiment. I'm rehearsing it for the benefit of anyone who doesn't know it. I know you're familiar with it, where you've got to imagine you've woken up in a hospital and you're hooked up to some guy, this violinist who's dying of kidney failure, and he's hooked up so that he's using your kidneys, and the doctor says if you unplug, that's going to kill him, and so the question, but you have to be hooked up to him for 9 months, and then he'll be okay, and then you can leave, but you'll kill him if you unplug before then. Do you have an obligation to stay plugged into him? The intuition you're supposed to have, and which most people have, is no, you don't have that obligation. So the thought here is that, it would be wrong to force people to make a greater sacrifice of their bodily autonomy than they're required to do. David Boonin has a book called Beyond Roe. I don't know if you're familiar with it. He's making an extension. I actually recommend reading some of the later developments of Thompson's argument rather than the original one. The original paper, I think, is kind of convoluted. Also has the worst thought experiment of all time, which is the people seeds, where the people seeds thought experiment is totally ridiculous. Like, you're supposed to imagine, imagine these like little people seeds that float through the air. And what if one of them took root on your carpet and started growing into a person? Could you vacuum your carpet? It's like, that is a paradigm case of how you do not design a thought experiment. Yeah. So I love, I think I do have a much more positive sort of general take on the paper than you do. If people are curious, I actually wrote an obituary when Thompson died in Jacobin. So this is in 2020, and I talk about this a little bit there. But I think I actually have a line in that article where I'm like, okay, I don't love the people seeds. I think that the point she's making with it, right, is that the first step is supposed to be that okay, if you're being really careful to make sure the people seeds don't get in, then sure, it's fine to vacuum. And then even if you're maybe not that careful, sometimes you accidentally leave it open, the window open, and it's still okay to vacuum. And so I think that I get the structure for point. I think the illustration is badly chosen because I don't think that anybody anywhere has clear intuitions about what they think about people seeds, because how could you? That's it's so distant from our anything that that we actually have moral judgments about. I think I think there might be a way of getting at the same point that she's trying to make with people seeds. That's slightly different, which is. I think I'm about to give it to you. I think I'm about to give it to me. So Boonin, in this book Beyond Roe, he has one of the better variations of Thompson's argument. He points to a real court case. It's not a Supreme Court case. It's a local court case. I think it's McFall v. Shimp. Okay, so basically. What happened was this guy, I might be confusing who is in what role, but this person had bone cancer from exposure to asbestos, and he needs a bone marrow transplant. Okay. And he has a rare marrow type, and it turns out that he finds out that his cousin is the right type. His cousin refuses to donate the marrow, and so he sues him. And he is not successful. The judge, Flaherty, I think it was, said that it's just outrageous. You don't have a right to another person's body. That would completely destroy the whole basis of law, right? So he did not get the marrow transplant, and he died. And the whole book is building on that case to make a legal case for abortion, I guess, after Roe, because I think it's a number of people have thought that this would be a firmer foundation on which to found a constitutional right to abortion. But I'm just considering it here as a moral argument. I don't know about the legality of it. Morally, does who is it? McFall have a right to Shimp's bone marrow? It doesn't seem like it. Okay. So what do I say to the autonomy argument? I mean, I guess the first thing to note is that there do seem to be limits to this right to bodily autonomy. You were emphasizing positive duties to others in the previous segment of this very episode. Thompson herself, in the original article where we get this argument, does say some things that say, well, there are certain cases where it would just seem to be indecent not to allow the person to use your body for a little bit. Like, what if McFall just needed a blood transfusion, right? Maybe the law shouldn't compel it, but it does seem indecent to let somebody die over that. And another thing, this is, I think, the biggest objection I have to Boonan's argument there is he relies on the fact that this is one super rare, weird case. He's relying on that very heavily. What I want to know, this is one objection I have. What I want to know is, if it were the case that every cousin, like with every cousin pair, one of them is going to need a blood transfusion from or a bone marrow transfusion from the other, or millions of people were going to die, don't you think we'd have different intuitions about what our rights were and what the limits of bodily autonomy were? Don't you think that would be built into our law?
I'm actually not sure it would be. I mean, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I mean, I think kidney failure, for example, is not particularly rare. Right. So, and it nevertheless is not built into the structure of our law that, you have to give up a kidney against your will. Right. So it's all, which is just to say, I mean, that it's at least not obvious to me that if this were a much more common situation, right, or to bring it a little bit closer to pregnancy, that, was something that would be not like something that was always going to come up every time, but, was a sort of well-known common, development or something. It's I mean, maybe you're right, but it's at least not obvious to me that our laws and our moral intuitions would be different.
Okay. I think I disagree about that. I'll move on to other points, though.
Yeah. So let me just circle back for a second, right? Because I did just want to briefly ping off two things you said, right? So one of them was about positive rights, and the other one was about the sort of people seeds and and the role that those are playing in Tom and Judas Jarvis Thompson's argument. So it seems to me that, like, the point of that, right, in the paper, at least as I've always read it, right, was, okay, if you have the intuitions that that Thompson thinks you'll have, and I think we agree most people do have, although I guess for full disclosure here, I've met people who don't, certainly, right, but that most people are going to have about the sick violinist case, that the Society of Music Lovers, kidnaps you and hooks you up to the famous sick violinist, and if you detach yourself, you'll die. That the intuition that Thompson thinks you'll have, and most people have, is that it might be very noble of you to decide to be hooked up, but you shouldn't have to, and it would certainly be unjust for you to be, like, legally forced to. And one common reaction to that, right? I mean, of course, obviously, anybody who's taking an absolutist pro-life position will just say, I think that whatever principle you can extract from this just doesn't apply to pregnancy, at all, right, for reasons X, Y, and Z. But, like, another common response is to say, well, maybe this sort of case shows us that in some cases bodily autonomy can outweigh the right to life, but the sorts of cases where that can happen might be the cases that would involve, like, pregnancy due to rape, but they wouldn't be relevant to pregnancy resulting from consensual sex. And, and I think that the point about the people seeds, right? I mean, it's like, I think that is we agree it's not a well-chosen example, but I think it's supposed to address that. And I get what you're saying about the McFall case, which is actually, it was actually really interesting to hear that. But it's always seemed to me, right? You could even extend the original argument, right? Like without having to bring in anything as hard to wrap your head around as people seeds. Say, look, imagine society of music lovers kidnappings. This wasn't like a one-off thing, right? This was a big social problem, right? That the society of music lovers was always kidnapping people and hooking them up to sick violinists. If you're sort of trying to judge this idea, right, that consensual sex, amounts to consent to eventual pregnancy, which even like the McFall thing sounds like in that case, we're thinking about case where, consent is withdrawn later, right? But like, if you're even trying to judge, hey, is consenting to sex consenting to pregnancy at all, right, in the first place, right? Never mind whether it's withdrawn later. Look, extend the metaphor. Society of music lovers kidnappings, big social problem. You live in a neighborhood where there's very little society of music lovers activity, and you voluntarily move to one where it's more likely, right? Maybe you got a job there, maybe you like the nightlife better, maybe it's where all your friends live, but you don't want to be kidnapped, right? So you take, let's do the equivalent of the screens for the people seeds, right? You take all sorts of measures to protect yourself from being kidnapped. You install a home security system. You get a guard dog, but maybe every once in a while there's like a particularly effective, Society of Music Lovers team that like Ocean's 11's through all that stuff, and you get kidnapped anyway. The fact that you voluntarily did something that raised the probability somewhat doesn't really seem like it amounts to consent for that outcome. And
I agree.
I agree. Even if you got drunk one night and like forgot to turn on the security system, right? I would still think that, right? So I want to talk. I do want to loop back to the positive rights thing in a minute, but I want to give you a chance to bounce off that.
Yeah, Boonin addresses this argument in his previous book called A Defense of Abortion. Man, he really should have come up with a more original title. As his previous book, fleshing out Thompson's argument in the paper of the same title. And he's convinced me that is a good response. So the argument or the objection that Thompson's argument depends, or it only debunks, or it only shows that abortion is permissible in rape cases. I think that objection doesn't work. And I don't want to rely on natural teleology of like consenting to sex is consenting to the possibility of pregnancy. Some pro-lifers are comfortable defending that. I don't think I need to say anything like that to get my point across, because there are all sorts of other sort of cases that pro-lifers have raised that don't rely on any kind of natural teleology like that. So I'm happy to concede that point.
Okay, fair enough. So I did just want to briefly say something about positive rights, because I think what you said is like a sort of obvious, like reasonable worry about anybody who watched the whole show, right? So they watched the earlier segment. Here I am defending positive rights, and now, right? I think when I'm talking about abortion, that bodily autonomy should like really have a lot of weight, and you might think, well, hold on. I mean, if people have positive, have positive rights, then maybe that can justify, right? Violating bodily autonomy. But it seems to me that there's like quite a bit of stuff that I think we would, in terms of violations of personal freedom, that is well short of any of the kinds of examples we've been talking about, including, right, legally requiring people to stay pregnant, that we would, I think everybody would, right, rightly rule out on those grounds as ways to fulfill positive rights. So what I mean is like, if you think, as I certainly do, right, that there's a right to healthcare, if the only way, you still might think, I think very reasonably still might think, that if the only way to fulfill that right was by, in fact, frog marching doctors and nurses to work, like the point of a rifle, that would be way too much, right? That in that case, right, when the right to healthcare came into conflict, with the rights of, personal freedom, against forced labor, of doctors and nurses, they'd say, okay, never mind, right? That wins. I mean, we're just sort of fortunate that in actual cases, right, it seems very possible to fulfill the first right without such severe violations of the second right. And again, I really want to emphasize that, in terms of infringements on bodily autonomy, I think that, forcing somebody to stay pregnant against their will really strikes me as one of the most severe, right, that we can talk about. I mean, that you're again, as opposed to forcing somebody to take a shot, even forcing somebody to do like a blood transfusion, right? It's a little bit more extreme than forcing them to take a shot. I mean, forcing somebody to be, so physically enmeshed with somebody else, right? Let's just grant personhood here for the sake of argument, right? So physically enmeshed with somebody else that that they're like, that person is like, breathing the oxygen, that you're breathing in through their lungs, that's
sorry.
Oh no,
My light went off. Let me go turn that on.
Oh yeah, no problem.
Oh, okay.
All good. So yeah, it does strike me that, like, look, and granting the point, right, that like, I don't know that I'd say that, bodily autonomy rights are absolute. I'm sure you could come up with all kinds of cases where I'd be convinced, right, that something else could overwhelm them. I don't claim to have a magical formula in my back pocket for here's exactly how we should weigh competing values against each other so we get the nice, clean lexical ordering system, right? It's moral philosophy is hard. But it does strike me that if you give a fair amount of weight to bodily autonomy, that should really go pretty far in this case.
Okay. So I want to consider another case, actually a couple of other cases.
Sure. Yeah.
First I want to consider case, and then I want to ask a general principle question. So how about a case of Siamese twins where one could not be separated from the other except by killing him, right? So this would be a lifetime that they're suppose they're joined at the head, the hip, whatever, imagine whatever kind of case is vivid to you. And the only way that either of them can be free to enjoy their bodily autonomy is by killing the other. It doesn't seem to me like obviously you have a right to do that. And so that's the case. Here's the question. I want to hear what features of pregnancy make it such a severe violation of bodily autonomy, because it could be a number of different things that's being claimed here. One possibility is it's the total cost to the well-being of the pregnant person of enduring the pregnancy, the total cost. That's one view. Another view is there's something about something being deep inside you, or I don't know, something like that. Like if there were pills that made pregnancy, like that took away morning sickness, that made pregnancy much less painful and much less of a cost to well-being. By the way, my wife and I are expecting our second here in a few weeks, and I thank you. I do have profound respect for what women go through. Obviously, I've not experienced pregnancy myself. I guess maybe the next closest thing is to be living with someone who's experiencing. I understand it is seriously onerous. It is seriously onerous. So I don't want to downplay that at all. But I want to know, is it the total cost to the well-being? Is it about bodily movement and like freedom to move around? Because that's like a different consideration. Is it some combination of that? Is it something else? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I certainly don't have a precise yardstick for this to offer. I think it is pretty implausible to deny that we can have like at least a sort of rough intuitive ranking of how severe violations of bodily autonomy are, right? That if somebody, if you think about, I don't know, somebody who's like a crazed fan, like snipping off a little bit of hair from a rock star, right? That seems, that seems like it would be a much less severe, violation of their right to control their own body than like, giving them the Pfizer shot, like holding them down and giving them the Pfizer shot against their will, right? So you're like putting a substance in their body, without their permission, and that giving them the shot would be a less severe violation of the bodily autonomy than forcing them to do a blood transfusion, or certainly however you rank those two, certainly either of those two would be like way less than forcing them to give up a kidney, right? So, in other words, I think that even if like, yeah, what's the sort of exactly how do we do the ranking, right? What are the sort of principles we can extract from these intuitions about, how we should go about doing the ranking, that, even if these issues are a little bit murky, right? Like it does, maybe you have a different, maybe you have a different feeling about this, right? But it does strike me as pretty implausible to deny that some of these things are more profound violations of your right to control your own body than others of them are, right? Like, and this does seem pretty severe. I mean, maybe it seems pretty severe on a couple of different dimensions, right? That being pregnant, involves temporary-ish, right? But dramatic changes to your body, right? You mentioned morning sickness. You're talking about, again, a level of enmeshment with, for the sake of argument, another person, depending on the stage of pregnancy, we're talking about that's like, that's so extreme that, that you have, that like the process of separation, right, is famously often extraordinarily arduous, right? Like, that I was, I don't know, I just had lunch with some relatives the other day, and I was hearing all these stories about people being in labor for like 36 hours and, stuff like that, right? You're talking about, a incredibly painful, incredibly prolonged process for doing the separation, right? I mean, this really seems to me like a hell of a thing to force somebody to do. Maybe for the sake of argument, once we weigh all of our conflicting values as justified, I just really want to emphasize that it is really a hell of a thing to force somebody to do against their will. And I did just want to briefly address the Siamese twins, right? Because I think this is the best objection. And I think that, yeah, I mean, I think forcing somebody to stay connected to a twin is pretty extreme. I would say that, like, that one difference is that in this, the Siamese twin case, we're talking about sort of symmetrical body sharing, right? That there's no real sense, as far as I know, right? I mean, maybe there is if we sort of fill out enough details of the case. Maybe I just don't know enough about how twin conjoinment works, but like it does seem like there's no obvious sense in which one of these bodies is hosting the other one, that the other one is just living in it, right? There's just sort of this, at least roughly symmetrical, relationship between the two, right? So that, if you killed either one, right, the other one would survive. So there's no, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about the actual like anatomical logistics here. Like I certainly wouldn't claim to know very much about conjoined twins.
I don't see why that is
why it's
more significant. Yeah. It sounds like you're just bodily autonomy is super, super, super important and overrides even a right not to be killed. Oh, but only in pregnancy, not in the Siamese twin, because it's symmetrical. I don't know.
Okay, let's linger on this point for a second then, right?
Okay.
So the argument would just be that there's no sense, that like either of the two would have an equally good bodily autonomy, claim, right? To have, to be separated from the other one at the cost of that other one's life, right? So I mean, again, I'm at least assuming, right? This is maybe ignorant on my part, right? But like I'm at least assuming that that's the case, right? So if so, that does strike me as an intuitively different situation than you have, one person who can, survive just fine, right? Without the other, but the other is dependent for their survival on the first one, right? Like that does seem like, if that's right, that you have, that pregnancy in that sense is closer to the violinist and involuntary violinist donor case than the conjoined twins case. That seems relevant, right? So the point is not bodily autonomy is a nothing, right? In the Siamese twin case, I mean, of course it's not, right? Like I actually think if what I'm describing is right, then this might be a kind of moral tragedy, right? That you don't that there's that if you sort of if you granted what in any other case we would regard, right, in every other case besides Siamese twinhood, right? Like I don't think it's just a one-time principle for pregnancy. I think that it's like, I think that again, most of us would regard violations of bodily autonomy far, far, far short of this as just obviously unacceptable in like 99%.
Bone marrow transfusion is less onerous than pregnancy. I do think though I want to go back to what you were saying about some of your examples of the graduated levels of involved bodily autonomy. I think some of these cases are underdescribed, like cutting somebody's hair if it has like deep religious significance to them might be a very, very serious infringement of bodily autonomy. If what matters is how important it is subjectively to that person, if that's the metric that we're using or one of the metrics or one serious component of how do we weigh the subjective desire not to have your bodily space infringed with. But let's just suppose we go with that for a while. There are people who are very, very, very serious about being anti-vaxxers and who consider it like, you want me to inject something in my bloodstream?
I do just want to interject for 10 seconds to say that would not have occurred to me to think that like the subjective factor was what mattered here. I would just take it for granted that we were doing an objective ranking, but go on.
Okay. Curious, because I would have thought that how it felt subjectively to the person was a huge component of how much it ought to be weighed. But in any event, I think if that were the case, I think we would nonetheless think like, no anti-vaxxer, you have to have your routine vaccinations regardless of that. So that's one thing I guess I want to say. So I think it could be how much the person subjectively doesn't want the intervention to happen. That's one component. Another would be the total cost to the person's well-being. Now, this is another thing that I think is interesting, which is suppose we modify like the original, let's take the original Thompson violinist case. Okay. I think we're supposed to imagine that the interaction between these two people ends after, if the person stays hooked up, the violinist says, "Thank you, sir," shakes his hand and walks out the door or something. What if it's the case that their lives from then on are going to be intertwined in a way that gives deep meaning and significance to the life of the person who was plugged in to them? So what if I were to tell the person who's deciding whether or not to unplug from the violinist, hey, in the long run, if you stay plugged in to this guy, and if you go through with it, there is a very good chance that you're going to think that was the right decision from your own perspective, from your own well-being. because that is one feature of that case, and all of these cases that tends to be disanalogous with pregnancy. It's not always the case, but often the case. The person who is hooked up through pregnancy gets something positive that I think should count against the obviously very significant upfront costs and well-being, and I think it often outweighs it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think that that to me that doesn't seem very compelling, because I think that in most cases, right, when it comes to, you know, competent adults who are making their own decisions, etc., right? Like, I mean, you know, usually when we're considering forcing people to do things, or maybe not usually, very often, right, when we're considering forcing people to do things, we do think that it would be like to their own long-term good, right? You know, that like, look, you know, we're going to make you take this shot, but like, if you know, you're going to be grateful when you don't die horribly, right? You know, because of the disease, you know, that the shot, you know, the shot prevents. But if nonetheless, in that case, which again does strike me as a vastly milder violation of bodily autonomy, then, you know, we still wouldn't say, right, like, and, you know, and also, I mean, even certainly in terms of like well-being, right, you know, that the like, you know, the sort of risks that are associated with pregnancy are vastly greater than the risks that are normally associated, you know, with taking a vaccine, right? You know, that the chances, you know, that you'll have some sort of medically serious complication, you know, so much less upfront cost to well-being, much less if you share the basic intuition that's driving me, which it sounds like maybe you don't, but that there is like a sort of pretty clear ranking of like objective violation of bodily autonomy, right? That the person who, like, you know, the person who subjectively is uninterested in what happens to their kidneys, right? You know, that it would still be like a really profound violation, right, to take one of their kidneys, you know, without their consent. That, you know, on both of those grounds, right, you know, that this one seems much milder, and it's plausible that you would feel better, you know, like that you would be grateful subjectively later, right, that you had it. You know, I think we would nevertheless, you know, we would nevertheless say that, you know, that this would be this would be seriously unjust to force somebody to do this, or just like, you know, go to even loop back to the Cohen eyeball lottery case, right? Like, if we, you know, if we also had some sort of, you know, program where there was, you know, there was like a very rigorously observed pen pal program for, you know, for eyeball recipients and eyeball donors, right? You know, where so it was like very likely this happened in many cases, that as people got their, you know, their lifetime of letters from their formerly blind pen pal, that they came to realize that they were enriching the other person's life, you know, so profoundly that they actually thought it was worth it. I think we'd still normally say that it's that, you know, I mean, I don't know. Maybe you just have a different feeling about this, but
I think something's happened. I think the legality argument has crept into the pure moral argument here. I kind of want to bracket the legality stuff just for a minute.
Well, okay, but let's be really clear about what distinction you're making here, right? Because I think that that the sort of main interest that I've always had in this, right, is, would it be a serious injustice, right, to forcibly prevent somebody, right, from having an abortion, or, you know, to put that differently, right? Would it be like a morally serious injustice to force somebody to remain pregnant against their will, right? And that's kind of the main question that interests me, as opposed to like, you know, is it morally virtuous, you know, to stay pregnant, you know, if you don't want to, or wouldn't otherwise want to if you hadn't been convinced, you know, that it would be morally wrong not to. But maybe there is like a useful distinction here, and this will actually help bring out what your view is, right? So like, I mean, ultimately, I mean, I'm assuming this is not your position, but it would be interesting if it was, right? I mean, because there is a sort of, view that you could take that, abortion is wrong, but, it's like there's sort of no point to trying to legislate against it. I mean, this is like the sort of Elizabeth Brunig view, I think, that you should just like try to like do other sort of social policy interventions that'll lead there to be less abortions, but but you shouldn't actually like use the power of the state to force people not to have them, which if it were your view, I would say, look, it's not my view. We do still have a disagreement there, but like I have to say that would be a disagreement like I can get much less morally excited about.
No, that's not my view. That's not my view. I do think that if abortion is wrong for the reason that it is wrongful killing of a person or of a human being or of something with significant moral standing, then I don't see a compelling reason why the state shouldn't be involved. That's my position. But I just want to be clear that if I can't convince you of that, maybe I can convince you of some more modest claim.
Okay, yeah. Fair enough. Yeah.
I'm just and I do ultimately think that the morality of it, not the legality of it, is the real interesting question here. So I just imagine, what would I do? I'm hooked up to this violinist here, and I've got to pay this significant upfront cost in well-being. But suppose these other things are true. Suppose somebody had told me that there is a very good chance, not absolute, right? Like I want to be modest about how I set this up. Yeah. But there's a very good chance that if you stay plugged up and to this guy for the whole 9 months, this will work out. This will redound to your benefit in the long run. Is it permissible for me to unplug? I mean, not if I'm being compensated. I'm not so sure. The other thing.
So I want to be as clear as possible about what you just said you weren't sure about, right? So the claim is putting any questions of like what the laws should be to one side. The claim is that it might be morally wrong to unplug if it was the case that like you yourself would be grateful later that you did that you didn't, or that you there were a couple of things going on here. I want to make sure I'm separating out the threads, or that you would just be properly compensated later, or some combination of those two.
So I want to isolate a variable because two variables go together. Yeah. There's the upfront cost and well-being that the pregnant person is paying, and then there's the pure libertarian consideration of just the appeal to rights. Now, I can see where a libertarian is coming from to say, who cares whether this redounds to my well-being in the long run? It's my body, my choice, and it's my libertarian right that matters here. Yeah. I understand that perspective. I just think that if it's not, I think the more compelling sort of rationale for unplugging is like, look, it's my choice whether I want to make this kind of sacrifice of my well-being for this person.
Okay.
To me, that is the more compelling rationale. Like, do I have an obligation to make this sacrifice for this person? Right.
Okay.
And so that to me is the compelling rationale.
So just to be clear, like the case where you were considering, where you were saying, okay, it seems reasonable to me that you might have that obligation, right? What was the difference making thing? Like, what was it that made that reasonable?
Well, so I think we might have very strong positive obligations to other people. I donate to effective charities. I try to, do some positive. I mean, not nearly as much as Singer thinks I ought to. Sure. I'm not living up to that standard, but I feel compelled by, I might have strong obligations to do that. I don't see if Singer is right about those kinds of arguments. I'm not sure why it should end at my bank account as opposed to other sacrifices I might make. The reason why I might not have to make that sacrifice is I might just have a right not to sacrifice my well-being for someone else's. But if it turns out that I'm being compensated, or there's a good chance that I'll be compensated, I think that significantly weakens the case for the permissibility of not helping out the other person.
Okay. So I guess, and I mean, it seems to me that, okay, I mean, just to mention this, we don't have to dwell on it, right? But I mean, it does seem to me that while well-being considerations are one very relevant, thing that's going on here, right? I mean, the sort of disadvantages of being pregnant, the medical risks of being pregnant, all of that stuff, right? I mean, that is one very serious consideration here. And by the way, I also think, that the fact that you'll have a serious emotional relation, like that there's a very good chance that you'll have a serious emotional relationship with somebody in the future, to me kind of strengthens the autonomy point, because I think we normally think that like this is the sort of thing, whether somebody has an emotionally serious relationship, somebody is the sort of thing that in many other contexts we think should be up to them, right? That there's, I mean, obviously there's some emotionally serious relationships to us that like we have no control, that arise in ways that like, are going to be outside of our control. But I think that like generally speaking, we kind of think that who you have like strong emotional relationships with is the kind of thing that, that to the extent that it can be, right, should be up to you. But I think, but I would still like just at least plant my flag on separating well-being from autonomy, right? That in other words, like if I had, if for some reason, right, like I had to have somebody like stitched up to my back, so I was giving them like a kind of involuntary piggyback ride, like like all day for all day every day, for months, but they were like so light that there were no real physical consequences for me, and the procedure for attaching them and detaching them was like painless and risk-free. It still seems to me that like that would be like a really bad thing to make somebody do, if they didn't want to, right? So I would want to separate autonomy from well-being, but on the well-being point, when you say that, you're at least less sure about it, right? Like about how far that goes if you're being compensated later, like what sort of compensation do we have in mind here? I mean, is it like the emotional compensation you were saying earlier?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a huge part of it. That's a huge part of it. Avoiding the risk for regret. There actually is some empirical evidence. I looked at the paper, Corinne et al., 2021. It was like a survey of a study of 161, I think was the sample size of women. And they asked who were denied abortions. They asked, how do you feel about it? Like a week out and then like 5 years out. And overwhelmingly, they were glad that they didn't get them. I think that's an interesting data point. I think that's an interesting data point.
Although I've also heard the opposite. I mean, like I mean, not the opposite, but the complementary thing there, that like overwhelmingly women who do get abortions do not feel regret about it.
Okay, that might be true. That might be true. Let's see. I think there was one more point I wanted to make about the violinist case.
Yeah.
Which was and this comes up. This is another issue I had with Boonan's argument in the Shimp-McFall case, which is I think there is some playing of fast and loose with into like shifting between letting die intuitions and killing intuitions. So I like to give the example like, okay, you can detach from the violinist, but you have to kill him first. You have to like bash his head in with a baseball bat Don't worry, he's unconscious. Don't worry about that. There won't be any pain involved. But you do have to like physically kill the guy, and then you can unplug him. What's that do to our intuitions? Bunin claims to consider he's like, oh no, I'm considering it a killing because I imagine that the unplugging is initiating a causal process that leads to the death of the violinist. And I'm like, that's kind of weak. That's kind of described still like it's a letting die.
Yeah.
Now he does make the point that there are forms of abortion where it would probably be better described as letting die rather than killing. And he doesn't see, and the way he reasons is, well, okay, so we could have abortions that are just letting dies, not killings, if you think that's a meaningful distinction. But he doesn't think that there's much of a significant distinction between the killing abortions and letting die abortions. And no, I kind of reason the other way. I take the equivalency and I say, yeah, there doesn't seem to be much killing. There doesn't seem to be much of an intrinsic distinction between the killing abortions and letting die abortions, but why don't we regard them all as the killing ones? Why don't we take you kill the violinist first as like the intuitive anchor point rather than, I don't know, trying to keep that out of view, keeping it nice and tidy where you just unplug and you walk out of the room and you let nature take its course. So
I guess it would be less like bashing the violinist in the head first, and I think more like the way to separate him we just describe in some grisly way where you're doing very clearly killy things, right? In the process of separation. But the part that I did just want to focus on because we're getting close to the end, and this is very much my fault because I took us off in this other direction earlier. But I did just want to make sure you had a chance to circle back to it, right? Is when you were describing the killy version of the sick violinist case, you said, you sort of threw in, oh, and he's unconscious, but whatever, that doesn't matter, right? That's like, and so I am curious, right? Even though I think that our main disagreement here, right, is about to is about bodily autonomy and I mean, look, believe it or not, like the like even in the Siamese twin case, like I do feel some pull towards that. I just I really do just think like, well, neither of them seems to have a better claim than the other one, right? But that the way you put that just now, right? Maybe this wasn't intended, right? Made it suggest to take us back for the last few minutes that we have together to the issue that I took us off earlier because I'm really curious about your view, right? Yes. Moral status, right? The way you just put that made it sound like you think that like your sort of view that you would consider defensible. You said earlier that you don't like dismiss like the extreme pro-life view, right? You have conception, you have moral status from conception onward, right? But you're not sure about it, right? So the way you put it earlier made me wonder if the cutoff point for moral status that you would kind of plant your flag on would still not necessarily rely on consciousness. So I did just want to give you a chance to kind of tell me what your view is on like when fetuses get moral status. Like what your view is on when you're relatively confident maybe that fetuses have moral status.
Okay. So I'm a little bit undecided about this. I think there are really only two plausible cutoff points. One of them is conception, right from the get-go, at which point you have a new organism. The other point is where you have the emergence of mind. Now, I don't know when exactly that happens. I tend to think, actually, Nathan Nobos, who is fairly pro-abortion, takes a version of that view, but he tends to estimate the emergence of mind later than I do. I tend to think that mind can be extremely minimal, and still confer moral status as long as you've got a living thing that is conscious that has some like capacity or potential for future experiences of real value. So let me make this one point. You mentioned the word capacity in our brief discussion of moral status. I want to point out that it's very hard to draw a line between potentiality and capacity, because the word capacity has a kind of built-in potentiality to it, right? So do I speak Russian? No, I don't speak Russian at all. But do I have the capacity to speak Russian? I think I do. I think I have that capacity.
Yeah, this is the David Lewis line from the Paradoxes of Time Travel that an ape can't speak Finnish, but because it doesn't have the right larynx, whereas I can. But don't take me to Finland. Helsinki is your translator because I can't speak Finnish, right? And he's like, it's just his cute way of like making the point that like can is really ambiguous.
Yeah. So Mary Ann Warren has an argument arguing. She takes the line that the fetus has no moral standing. And if the fetus has no moral standing, we don't even need to get into all of these variations of the violinist case, because it's just like autonomy wins, no contest. But she emphasizes capacity, the capacities of rationality. And I think if that capacity is defined broadly enough that includes infants, then I think it's hard to be confident that it doesn't reach back much, much earlier.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. I guess the part that's confusing to me about that is how the present consciousness piece is connecting to the capacity piece. Like, in other words, like, I understand, like, because if what really matters here, right, is the capacity for future experiences, then yeah, sure, right. Like a fertilized egg has that, right? And arguably so does the unfertilized egg, right? But if what matters is consciousness, right? Then it seems like, well, from what I understand, you don't have like the first flickerings of detectable electricity in the fetal brain until fairly far along in pregnancy, like after most abortions happen. And it also seems plausible to me, without claiming to a knowledge that I don't have about fetal neuroscience, right? But like, my guess would be that like the first flickering of electricity in the fetal brain, considerably predates actual experiences, even very simple ones, right? In sort of much the same way that, my computer being plugged in is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for anything interesting happening on it. So I would, so if what matters is capacity for future experiences, then it's like, yeah, I mean, we're down to the fertilized egg, like the first minutes of the zygote, if not earlier, right? And I actually think it's a really interesting question how to exclude earlier as a possibility. But if what matters is capacity, I guess I don't understand why. I guess I don't understand why it's the conjunction that's important. Like, is that what you're saying? That's the conjunction that's important, the having present consciousness and the capacity for this other stuff later?
That's a possible view. I'm not sure. I do think that, like, if you consider the case of somebody who's in a coma, I think what matters is future experiences. The fact that the person has had experiences, I mean, yes, that is a difference between that person and an early fetus who has not yet had the first flickering of consciousness. I'm not convinced it's a morally relevant difference. I'm not convinced of that.
Okay, well, so just to like quickly recap, because for anybody who's lost track of what the positions are, right? I would just say, like, my own view is that I think before you have conscious experience starting, it seems very implausible to me that you have like the kind of moral status that would make you wrong to kill yet. Although I will also freely admit to being very uncertain about like what the sort of total set of conditions is that you have to meet, and even more uncertain about exactly when in pregnancy that's met. That's all a mess. I wouldn't claim to be sure. But what like really moves me the most in all of this is bodily autonomy, right? So what I'm hearing from you is, okay, we have this big disagreement about bodily autonomy. We spent like an hour on that. We don't need to go back to that, right? But like, but also you think that you have some pretty clear moral status, or actually, no, I want to be really careful that I've got your view right here. It's not that you think we have really clear moral status. It's that like you think that the sort of fuzziness and figuring out when moral status starts gives us like a pretty good reason to err on the side of treating the fetus as something with moral status from at least fairly early on, even if you wouldn't be an absolutist about it. Am I getting you right here?
Yeah, I am relying a bit on a principle of moral caution here because I'm not sure exactly where the line is. I'm not confident that it's all the way back. Could I end with a with a thought experiment?
Go for it.
So I think this is a real case. I heard this from somebody a long time ago. I don't keep up with this person anymore, but feel free to just take it as a hypothetical.
Sure.
Okay. So there was a woman who was raped and was pregnant as a result of that. And compounding that terrible thing and that tragedy, she had cancer that could be treated with chemotherapy. And the doctor advised her to get an early abortion and because the fetus would not survive this treatment.
Yeah.
Okay. She declined to do it. She carried the fetus to term and then died. And I think it's worth thinking about what we should think of somebody who does that. I think that's heroic. I think at very least, if you don't think that it's heroic, you should have some respect for this person's decision. But if an early fetus is like negligible in terms of its sentience, because I do believe it would have been early that she would have had it. This would have been like me running into my burning house to save my pet goldfish from being destroyed. Like, I just don't think many people are going to have that kind of reaction to this case. I think that intuition I take to be some evidence in thinking. I think even early fetuses have some kind of significance, moral standing. I know it's very, very tragic. It's very sad, and shame on that son of a bitch who put her in that situation.
Yeah, for sure. For sure on that last part. I mean, yeah, I think that's an interesting case because I mean, I think you're right. Most of us, I think would have that intuition, which is at least suggestive of belief in moral status from very early on. I'm sure you're familiar with the sorts of cases that people bring up to suggest that most of us don't really think that deep down, right? Like the sort of like you've got the case with like 500 frozen zygotes in it, and
those cases do give me pause. They do.
Yeah, and like one toddler, and like nobody anywhere would hesitate to save the one. Maybe look, there's always one person, right? But
the utilitarian would.
Yeah, all the more reason to think utilitarianism is demented, but which might actually be something we agree on. But yeah, I think that the stuff I think the coma thing is interesting too, because I think that there's a question there that's like a sort of metaphysics of personal identity question, right? Like what is it that if there's a difference, right? It's got to be that we think that the person after they get out of the coma is the same person, right, as the person before they went into a coma. So there's like there's a person who exists whose existence you're ending, as opposed to just a potential person who could come into existence who you're stopping from. But I will also freely admit here that look, there's a list of subjects I feel pretty sure about. I feel pretty confident about my opinions, and the metaphysics of personal identity is not on that list.
Oh, same here. That's a total mess. that stuff.
Yeah,
Every single view has crazy implications.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna pretend be like, oh yeah, no, that's like I'm 100% sure that that's right, which is why I think perhaps why the that's definitely not a person yet view is less compelling to me than the sort of autonomy based considerations that I was coming up with earlier. But is there any? I try to. When people are nice enough to come on my show who disagree with me, I try to give them the last word before they go. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I mean, I could always add more, but I think you've let me say my piece. I think I've said enough, and I'm very grateful that you've given me a platform to do this. I'm very happy to have a left-wing friend who can hear me rant about these things or try to persuade you with them.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, this is a pleasure. Anytime you wanna pick an issue and come back, I was happy to do it again. So Spencer, you can find, he does a podcast that he has a lot of interest in people on called Micro-Digressions. Which you can find, I think, is everything also on YouTube now, or is some stuff only on the podcast feed?
The episodes from 2024 are on YouTube. The earlier episodes are audio only.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so yeah, you can find it on all the regular podcast places if you want to go back and be a completist, listen to the whole catalog. But yeah, I don't know. Best of luck, and congratulations on the impending kids. So yeah, that's and I will talk to you soon.
Yeah, I hope to have an exciting update, but by the next time we speak.
Absolutely. All right, thanks, Spencer. All right. Jake, is there stuff I missed? Do you need to hold me accountable now?
Yeah, I do. The opposing, what was it? The counter arguments segment. No, it was
opposing counter argument.
I was doing the thought experiment. I love thought experiments, by the way, especially the pen pal, like where you're having a pen pal with the violinist that you kept alive. But I was doing one in the chat about, like, basically if fetuses were just as conscious as I was just calling it some guy named Bob, but actually Matt Gilbert in the chat pointed out it's a major plot point in Dune, so I don't have to make up some silly Bob, like it's just like some guy being Bob, like named Bob, who's like, hey, can we watch the game? Like, why didn't you turn on the like the game is like close right now. Like, can you flip to ESPN? Right. That I feel like, but the point of that is, like, I was just curious if that would change your view on, like, would that create a limit on the bodily autonomy argument?
Sorry. Can we do the case one more time to make sure I got that? Because I feel like I lost.
Yeah, I started doing like bad stand up at the end. So it was a little confusing. Basically, it's just if the fetus was completely inseparable from a regular person in terms of their intelligence and ability to communicate.
Sure.
But the interesting thing is that that's actually a plot point in Dune. Alia the or Addie, I don't forget if I'm pronouncing.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, like, would my feelings about abortion be different? Because, like, for so much of that conversation, I was just granting the personhood thing for the sake of argument, right?
Exactly.
Like,
which I was trying to tell some people in the chat who came later, by the way, because they were like, "What is it?" But it's not a person. And I was like, "Yeah, Ben agrees with you."
No, I mean that like classic Judith Jarvis Thompson paper we talk about defense of abortion. Like, one of the first things she says in the first couple paragraphs is like, "Look, I don't believe first trimester fetus is a person any more than an acorn is an oak tree, but let's just grant that and see what follows, right?"
Yeah.
So all right, I think I've got the case now, right? So the idea is, if Gene Baudulin is watching, he'll be very upset when he realizes how little I know about Dune. But the case is like, okay, so you're saying all this given that we're saying, okay, we're conceding for the sake of argument that this either like literally completely mindless, like early fetus, or at best, like fetus at some point where it might be starting to have some kind of flickerings of consciousness, right? That we're assuming for the sake of argument that that counts as a person. And what you're wondering is, okay, do my intuitions change if it's like not just something that I'm sort of counting as a person, but is like literally mentally indistinguishable from a person and can communicate with me like a person would.
Yeah,
and,
I was just imagining like just having the vibe of like a middle-aged guy, just because I thought that was funny. Yeah. Does that change?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I don't think it changes it enough that my position would change. But it's like, look, I mean, I think that that's kind of what the whole point was about the sick violinist and all that, right? I mean, that you have somebody who's like,
of course, yeah,
unambiguously a person, right? So it's like, I mean, let's put it this way. I mean, I think that the bodily autonomy stuff is extremely powerful to me. It's funny. We actually had somebody at one point in the chat who was like, "Oh, this sounds like some like bourgeois liberalism to me," and what I told him, what I think is like, yeah, you're right, it is, right. I mean, this is like the sort of basic liberal rights that like, the bourgeois democratic revolutions that, took us from like the ancien regime to like democratic capitalist modernity were about. And that's good, right? I mean, those are good things, right? I'm a socialist because I don't think it's enough, right? But I mean, that's the baseline, right? Like I care a lot about bourgeois liberal rights, right? So yeah, like that they have it. So I do think bodily autonomy is really, really important. Now, if you have something that's literally completely mindless, from my perspective, there's basically nothing weighing on the other scale against bodily autonomy, right? I would certainly say in the Dune case, the fetus is communicating with you to ask you to like, stay in the room to finish watching the game, right? Like, does that make it a way harder case? Yeah, definitely, right? Like it's not like, would I say, therefore, I think that you should be, to switch back to the question that I care the most about, right? That like, therefore, I think you should be legally forced to stay hooked up to this person.
Right.
Probably still no, but like I would certainly hesitate a lot more in the circumstances.
If your friend was just casually like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get rid of Bob, or I'm gonna get rid of Bob. You're gonna be like, you're gonna be like, oh, okay, no, like probably now.
You want to drive to the clinic?
Yeah, I'm gonna. And then, unfortunately, there's like a lot of.
It's a much like. Yeah, I think in that case, there's like a much morally weightier like counter consideration than there is in like anything that I actually think is similar to pregnancy, right? Like if like even with the violinist case, it's like, look, I think that you should have, even if the violinist is like a bit more out of it than that, right? Like they have it like like, yeah, I mean, I think that like it's probably, like one of the things we normally think about consent is that it can in fact be withdrawn, right? So like, I think even if you'd agreed to stay hooked up to the violinist, I'm pretty bothered as a rights violation by saying that like, even if that happened, you should be legally forced to stay hooked up. But if it was like, oh, you were having like like when the violinist was having his like afternoons of lucidity, right? You'd have like whole conversations with him and whatever. And like, you were just like, oh, you know what? I remembered I was going to go through with it. I was going to stay hooked up to the violinist, but I remembered like 6 months in that I had concert tickets next week. So yeah, I unhooked myself. Man, it was brutal. You wouldn't believe like how awful this, how violent this unplugging process was. I would not, I mean, again, I don't know that I want the state to like force you, but like, yeah, I would get morally uncomfortable with that decision making, right? Just because like it doesn't seem very virtuous, right? Like the more of a recognizable person, there you have, I think the harder decision it is morally, but like also again, I mean, I think forcing somebody to share their body against their will, like, really does strike me as like one of the deepest and most objectionable violations you could have of somebody's general right to control their own body.
Yeah, no, I gets at very similar things to the violinist example, which I didn't immediately see. Yeah, I think that clears everything up. What I was gonna say is I'm seeing from the chat that the Dune example has also actually different implications than the Bob example.
Okay. I'm not gonna.
Which I think we don't have.
I'm just gonna say we're not. You know, if you want to bring on Gene and have a whole Dune conversation, that's fine. But I think for me, I'm not going to delve into the details of the Dune example tonight. I will also say that our friend and repeat former GTAA guest Branko Marcetic is in LA right now, and I think his Uber gets to my place in like 10 minutes. So I think I am going to pull the plug for the evening. But in any case, let's see. So next, what's going on next week? I'm actually not 100% sure about the main show next week. There are a couple of things that might be happening in the main show. It depends. It depends. You know, how that ends up landing with everybody's schedules. But I do want to plug, since we do not have a main show, we do not have post game tonight, right? I gotta get going. You know, I gotta get going in just a minute, so we can't do a post game for patrons tonight. But we did line up something pretty good for next week's post game already, which is, Jake, you've probably seen this, right? But just in case you haven't, we're not going to watch the whole thing right now, right? I just want to give people a flavor of it. This is one of the YouTube videos a few months ago that I was kind of most delighted by. It's called Finkelstein versus Dershowitz, the musical.
Has concocted a fraud, which amazingly, in large parts, he plagiarized from another fraud. I found that pretty shocking. I found it shocking coming from a Harvard professor. I find it shocking coming from any professor. Now we have to cut off at one point. I just want to warn everybody here that though I'm not a litigious person, when you make allegations I'm prepared to support them. That's a technical term which has great legal implications, and I can't obviously quietly buy and accept an allegation. Let's look at the evidence. Who is the plagiarism from? Okay, let's look at the evidence. In the first 2 chapters of your book, you extensively reproduce all of Joan Peters' pages in her book. I read it carefully in 1984. Show me one sentence. I'm gonna show you. Show me one sentence. I am gonna show you. I think I made available the charts to you. No, you showed me nothing. Let's start with that. That's a categorical lie. What you're hearing now on radio is a claim that Mr. Finkelstein made available to me certain charts. That is a categorical lie. No, he said to me, oh, Mr. Dershowitz, I think you had about 5 minutes time. I wasn't looking at the clock. If we're going to have a civil it's not going to be a debate about me. Let me be very clear about that. I'm not debating you. I have no interest in you, Mr. Dershowitz. None at all. I'm interested in the scholarship. I'm interested in the facts. And I'm interested in your book. Now in 1984, one Joan Peters published a book called From Time Immemorial. The book was universally recognized by serious scholars to be a fraud. Without wanting to toot my own horn, I'm universally recognized as the person who exposed the fraud. I know that book inside out. I read it at least 4 times, and I went through all 1,854 footnotes. I started to read your book, Mr. Dershowitz. I then came to chapter 1, footnote 10, footnote 11, footnote 12, footnote 13, footnote 14, footnote 15, footnote 16. All of the quotes are from Joan Peters. They are so from Joan Peters that you have a long quote here from Mark Twain on page 23 and 24. I turned to Joan Peters, page 159 to 160, the identical quote from Twain with the ellipses.
Is it wrong? Is the quote wrong? Wait, let me ask you. Is the Twain...
the ellipses.
Is the Twain quote
Let
wrong?
me finish, sir.
No, but the key is the
With
Twain...
the ellipses in the same places. The identical quote from Twain. With the ellipses in the same places.
Yeah, it goes on for another minute or two, but yes, having done the debate breakdown of that, and also had Norm, who's been on the show probably half a dozen times, come on to do a little retrospective at the beginning of our breakdown where we interviewed him for like an hour, reminiscing about that debate. I enjoyed that so much. I mean, like even some of what he's doing, like if you spend enough time watching Norm, like even the way the guy in the video is like kind of leaning like this, and some of the stuff he's doing with his face is just very, very Norm-esque. And you know, I think he's also captured the essence of Alan Dershowitz. But in any case, that dude is definitely coming on the post game next week. He has many other videos that I similarly enjoy. Tom from Yakubia wants to know when Alan Dershowitz is coming on the show. Mr. Dershowitz, if you're watching, and I assume you are, the door is open. Tell us the episode, and we will clear the schedule for you. I think we could have a fascinating conversation about everything from genocide to Epstein Island. So this, no matter who we've got booked, we will bump them for Alan Dershowitz if he takes us up on this.
Yeah. I'll see to it, Ben. I'll get on that.
All right. Yes. Sounds good. All right. Well, as has all been so much fun, we've gone way longer than I intended to, so we are going to cut it there for tonight. We'll see you in some form or another next Monday. Post game next Monday. I'm really looking forward to. See everybody then. Left is best.